Hey, today I wanted to share some thoughts about personality psychology, which has recently become an interest of mine, and more specifically my experiences as a so-called INTJ type. This video will probably just be me talking, so feel free to do something else in the background if you want to listen. I'm not a so-called YouTuber, and I have no aspirations to be one either. See, I found a light that's shining on me. You might be able to see a shadow back here. Not sure. It's good enough, and I wanted to just share some thoughts and experiences for whoever might be interested. I think it's 5 years after I last made a video on here. So I'm a textbook example of an INTJ. It is almost embarrassing how well that type actually describes me. That means the following according to the MBTI classification. I have introverted intuition as a dominant function, or a hero function, extroverted thinking as a parent function, internal feeling as a child function, and extroverted sensing as an inferior function. So the first thing I want to talk about, INTJs have the reputation of being some kind of logical robot with no emotions for some reason. But in reality, the INTJs are dreamers. We live in the world of possibility and what could be, primarily because of that hero function, introverted intuition. When I consciously think about it, I spend probably 95% of my time in my own head in a total fantasy world that I myself have created. I spend very little time actually in the real world. And I think it's interesting because on the one hand, dreams are in the process of becoming tacitly obsolete in our society. On the other hand, the disadvantage of this is, of course, that the INTJ is in a real danger of being someone who eats the menu instead of the food, so to speak, because we spend so much time in our own heads that we often completely lose sight of what is around us in any kind of given moment. And the function which causes a lot of problems for us is the extroverted sensing inferior. I've always said that being an INTJ is like being a walking contradiction. Because on the one hand, you are an incredibly high performer, almost by default, almost guaranteed to be involved in all kinds of intellectual, abstract, conceptual pursuits. And yet on the other hand, the INTJs can be incredibly insecure, and I experienced this myself, just crippling insecurity at times, and especially the paranoia, which can very easily set in, because we do have that inherent lack of trust in almost everyone in the surroundings. We are so afraid of abandonment, and we really, really do value loyalty. And as a result of that, if left on our own to self-destruct, we often tend to perceive problems where there aren't any. Just this kind of paranoia that bad things will happen, that people around us will abandon us, even if there's absolutely no objective signs of those people even thinking about doing that. We still have a tendency to create that for ourselves. And as a result of that, it can very easily become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because it's always very important to remember that you do see in the world what you want to see. And if you see other people in the world judging you negatively, and you believe that, that is what your brain is going to search and find out and seek out. Whereas if you perceive people simply being normal people, not having any inherent negative thoughts about you, that is what you'll see. I think as an INTJ, it's quite interesting because on the one hand, I often feel a lot of insecurity about making other people feel bad or potentially giving them a negative experience in some way. I think this is interesting because on the one hand, the INTJs are also in many ways the people who care least about what other people think, in the sense that very often we feel like we are better than other people. And often we are better than other people, let's be real. And as a result of that, at the same time, we get that performance anxiety about potentially making someone else feel negative or feel bad. And it is perhaps a consequence of this kind of internal God complex, as it's called, that we tend to have. We feel absolutely all-powerful, absolutely just amazing, supernatural beings, and yet at the same time we're afraid of talking to random people because we might create an awkward situation for them. It's just one of the many inherent contradictions to this personality. So then we have childhood, and that was fun, wasn't it? I think that childhood, unfortunately, for the INTJ type is often being completely misunderstood by absolutely everybody. I remember that people were always trying to get me to talk when I did not want to. I always had the reputation of being the quiet one, even though I personally felt that I actually contributed quite a bit. And I apparently had a shell around me and I apparently still do. How many times have I heard that, being told that I had to come out of my shell? And I want to kill people that say that. I still do, because that is the worst thing to be told, especially when you do not personally perceive that you have a shell around you, or that you actually need to do anything more than you actually want to. And I think there was also that kind of interesting idiosyncratic experience of feeling like I inconvenience people with just the way that I like to live in the world and the way that I naturally existed. And this happens at the same time while being absolutely head and shoulders above other people in terms of school, for example. I was that kid in school who would just not study for anything and still get absolute top marks. Not always in math, interestingly enough, but basically in anything else. And yet at the same time, constantly having that experience that there was something wrong with you. It is very underestimated, looking back on it now, having done a little bit of the reading, to actually think about how that actually impacts you as a child, to sort of constantly be perceiving in your unconscious, to be receiving that information from the surroundings, that there's something wrong with you. It can really start a long battle for self-esteem. And unfortunately, I guess, childhood, not always fun. I think, to sum it up, it was just many years of being forced to do what I did not want to do, kind of all the time. And now, to be fair, adult life is not always that different from that. But I think definitely, as a child, we have, of course, this internal desire to at least perceive that we have a choice with introverted intuition. So one thing that I've been dealing with recently, the INTJs are very goal-oriented. We know exactly what we want, and we like to spend absolutely all of our possible time moving towards that goal. We really, really do value movement. And this tends to lead to a very narrow focus and awareness of time, and a type of destination thinking, where we tend to think that it's only after we get to that given destination in the future that we imagine for ourselves, that we then will be able to feel good about ourselves. And I think one interesting consequence of this that I've sort of been noticing recently is that I become very unwilling to participate in things which I do not perceive to directly in some way contribute towards any given goal that I might have consciously or unconsciously set. And this can lead to a certain degree of isolation. I thought about this the other day. If given the option between, on the one hand, spending 10 minutes talking about meaningless stuff with some random person at the coffee machine at work, or on the other hand, spending those 10 minutes reading a book which has some knowledge in it, which I believe that I need, I would choose all day and every day the second option. I think it's quite interesting at the same time that there exist people I know who would absolutely prefer the first option. I've always said this, there are two types of people in a workplace. On the one hand, there are those types of people who walk up to the coffee machine in the morning, see the room completely empty, and think, yes, now I get to avoid meaningless small talk with some random idiot about what they did this weekend. And there are other people who walk into that same coffee room, see nobody at the coffee machine, and think, oh, how boring is this? No, I don't have anyone to talk to. I'm just standing here getting my coffee by myself. So I came across two interesting analogies recently, which I think sum up this personality type quite well. Number one is the ranger. The INTJ likes to go off and do his or her own thing, and sort of spend long periods of time by his or herself. We really do require, I would say, that sort of opportunity for complete isolation. And then at the same time, now and again, on our own terms, we like to kind of come back into society and participate in various things here and there, once again, when we feel like we want to. And then we'll go off out by ourselves again for another long period of time before we come back. The second analogy is a pirate, and this has a slightly negative connotation, perhaps well-deserved, because as INTJs, we create treasure, and we also like to take it from other people. And at the same time, we have an inherent fear of abandonment, a very, very strong fear of abandonment. And I think in its most negative form, this takes the form of us going out, plundering, trying to take other people's treasure and hoard it all for ourselves with very little consideration for what kind of collateral damage that process might cause. And so I mentioned slightly about the INTJ being misunderstood, and there's no question about it that we are. Because what I find interesting is that inside the INTJ, behind the facade, is a very warm, cute, insecure, sweet little personality that ultimately just wants to make the world better, just like everybody else. The problem is that it is encased often in many layers of armor. If the INTJ was a building, this right here would be the facade that we have. Very sort of cold, arrogant, uninviting exterior, at least on the surface. But on the inside, we look like this. Open, willing to bend light, gravity, and time for the people that we care about, to help them in any possible way. Willing to work as hard as possible in order to achieve our goals and make the world a better place. And I think the reason that the INTJ does have this sort of misunderstood character is exactly this, that because we're so selective about who we actually share our energy with, it means that so few people actually get to see this beautiful inside. And another thing I was thinking about recently, I'm of course an INTJ male. I cannot imagine what it would be like to have this personality as a female. I don't think I've ever met an INTJ female. I've met perhaps an ENFJ female. And I think as a male, of course, one advantage of being an INTJ is that it is an incredibly masculine, attractive personality. No one performs higher than these people. No one is more attractive by default than INTJs, especially with extroverted sensing inferior. And one could say that, of course, as a man, you do have the burden of performance, but I cannot imagine what it would be like to have to deal with idiots all day as a girl, especially getting the attention that the majority of girls receive by virtue of being girls. So towards the end here, I thought that what I would do is talk about some solutions, because what do we do as INTJs when we encounter a problem? We zoom out, we identify issues, and we implement solutions. So I think one perspective, which is very interesting to have, I think, is that it is important to remember that all personalities have their advantages and disadvantages. And I think that's one of the things which is most interesting about people in general, is that people are good at different things naturally, and people have different natures, and they have different inherent qualities. And I think that is one important thing to remember, not least as an INTJ, is that while you might struggle with certain things, which especially might seem to come naturally for a lot of people, on the other hand, you're able to explore territory which very few other personalities are actually able to explore once you do the necessary development. I can honestly say at this point that I really enjoy the way that my brain is wired. I wouldn't want it to be wired any other way. I think it is a really weird way of living, and I can honestly say that I would not want to change that at all. It took a long time to get to that point, but it is possible to get to that point. I know what I do well, I know when I'm wasting my time, and when I need to get shit done, I will move mountains to do so. It's fantastic. And so I think secondly, and this is one thing which I kind of discovered recently, try to be aware of how little you actually give to the external environment as input. Which is to say, try to share a little bit more, especially in social situations which you might perceive to be completely meaningless or to have no benefit at all to you. As said before, we spend so much of our time in our own heads, and I think that we imagine ourselves through our intuition as having participated a whole lot more than we actually have participated in any given situation. I think there's many conversations where I am constantly imagining I'm listening, especially crowds. We don't like crowds, do we? One-on-one is fantastic, but as soon as I get put in a group of more than 4 or 5 people, I just shut off. and I listen instead. And you can almost see me just kind of float away into my own thoughts. It's quite funny. I was told that once. And I think it is very easy to not really be aware of actually how little how little input we're giving to the surroundings. We think that we're having these conversations in our heads about everything that's being said, and in reality, seen from the outside, we're literally just sitting there like a piece of furniture. It's quite funny. And the other really kind of deep solution, which has really helped me deal with a lot of the inherent disadvantages of the INTJ personality, is the philosophy of Zen. I don't mean Zen Buddhism specifically, but rather just Zen. And I would recommend starting with anything by Alan Watts. There are many of his lectures here on YouTube, and any of his books are just fantastic to sort of help us de-intellectualize our experiences. Because as an INTJ, your intellect is so unbelievably overactive, and especially your imagination also, that you end up living in a world of illusions. And for me, really becoming familiar with the philosophy of Zen, which is first and foremost the philosophy of reality as it is, has helped me immensely get out of my own head and actually live in reality and understand that the vast majority of the problems that I face are 100% created by myself and do not actually exist in reality itself. As Alan Watts said in one of his lectures, it's amazing what doesn't exist in the world. And I think we, as INTJs of all people, can relate to that, given that when we actually realize it, the vast majority of our fears, the vast majority of what we struggle with, the vast majority of the problems that we perceive are not actually in the world at all. They're only in our own heads. So those were my thoughts. I'm not sure how long this video actually will be, but I had some time and I thought, why not talk to the internet a little bit about personalities. So I hope that was useful.